In just 11 days, the Soviet Union achieved what seemed impossible, annihilating an entire Japanese army of nearly 1 million men with a kill ratio of 30-1. They advanced faster than any campaign in Europe while settling a 40-year-old debt of national humiliation. This was Operation August Storm, and it changed the course of World War II in ways the world still struggles to understand. The story begins not in 1945, but 4 decades earlier, with a wound so deep it transcended revolutions and political systems. It was a humiliation that burned in Russian memory, waiting for the chance to be erased completely. And when that chance came, the Soviets would unleash a form of warfare so devastating that an entire army would simply cease to exist. Every nation remembers its humiliations, but few get the chance to erase them so completely. For Russia, that humiliation came in 1905, and it cut deeper than any military defeat before or since. The Russo-Japanese War began on the night of February 8, 1904, when Japanese destroyers launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur. What followed was a cascade of disasters that shook the Russian Empire to its core. At the Battle of Mukden in February and March 1905, over 300,000 Russian troops faced the Japanese in the largest land battle the world had yet seen. Both sides lost roughly a third of their forces, but the Japanese drove the Russians from the field. Mukden fell. The defeat was total. Then came Tsushima. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed 18,000 nautical miles around the world to break the Japanese blockade of Port Arthur. On May 27, 1905, the Japanese intercepted them in the straits between Korea and Japan. What happened next was not a battle, but a massacre. The Japanese sank or captured most of the Russian fleet. Thousands of Russian sailors died. Japanese losses were minimal. It was the most complete naval victory since Trafalgar. The Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905 formalized Russia's defeat. Japan gained control of Port Arthur, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Russia recognized Japanese dominance in Korea and evacuated Manchuria. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated a European empire in a major war. The trauma went beyond military defeat. Inside Russia, the disaster triggered the Revolution of 1905. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to grant constitutional reforms he never intended to honor. The humiliation became embedded in Russian national consciousness. It transcended the fall of the Tsarist regime in 1917. The Bolsheviks inherited the wound, and they never forgot it. Soviet military doctrine developed in the shadow of 1905. The Red Army's emphasis on modernization, mechanization, and what they called deep operations reflected a determination to never again suffer from the indecision, poor leadership, and technological inferiority that had doomed the Tsarist forces. Soviet commanders studied the failures at Mukden and Tsushima the way surgeons study fatal errors. They would not repeat them. When Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky planned Operation August Storm in 1945, he made the revenge explicit. Soviet propaganda and military orders referenced settling accounts for 1905. The recapture of Port Arthur was given priority attention despite its limited military value. Soviet forces would deliberately raise the red banner over the fortress where Russian defeat had begun 40 years earlier. The symbolic reversal of Tsushima became as important as the military objectives. This was not just a campaign, it was the erasure of national shame. But revenge requires an enemy, and by August 1945, the once fearsome Kwantung Army that had terrorized Asia was no longer what it seemed. The Kwantung Army's reputation was built on brutality and victory, but reputations can outlive reality. By the summer of 1945, the force that Tokyo still called its elite Continental Army was a hollow shell wearing the uniform of its former self. The Kwantung Army had originated as a garrison force to guard Japanese interests around Port Arthur after the Russo-Japanese War. By the 1930s, it had evolved into Japan's primary instrument of imperial expansion on the Asian mainland. In 1931, Kwantung officers engineered the Mukden Incident, fabricating a pretext for the full-scale invasion and occupation of Manchuria. They established the puppet state of Manchukuo and operated with stunning autonomy, often acting without orders from Tokyo. At its peak, The Kwantung Army numbered over 700,000 men and included some of Japan's finest infantry, armor, and cavalry units. But that was before the Pacific War consumed everything. As American forces island hopped toward the Japanese home islands, Tokyo stripped the Kwantung Army of its best divisions, equipment, and experienced personnel. Elite units were redeployed to desperate defenses in the Philippines, Okinawa, and the home islands themselves. What remained in Manchuria by August 1945 was a facade. The numbers told the story of decay. Of 25 divisions, only 6 were considered combat ready. The rest consisted of poorly trained conscripts, reservists, and rear echelon support personnel. Many units existed only on paper. The Army's nominal strength was 700,000, but only about 600,000 were actually available, and most of those were undertrained and under-equipped. The equipment disparity was staggering. The Kwantung Army fielded approximately 1,155 tanks, but most were obsolete Type 97 Chaiha and Type 95 Heigo light tanks with thin armor and weak guns. They were no match for modern Soviet armor. The Japanese had about 6,700 artillery pieces, but ammunition was scarce. Their air force numbered around 1,800 aircraft, but fuel shortages meant most were grounded, and those that could fly were obsolete designs facing modern Soviet fighters and ground attack aircraft. Japanese defensive doctrine remained rooted in World War I concepts. Despite intelligence awareness of Soviet mobile warfare capabilities, especially after the devastating defeat at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the Kwantung Army's plans relied on static fortifications and linear defense. They had constructed what they called the Manchurian Wall, a series of bunkers, pillboxes, and defensive lines designed to stop frontal assaults. Many of these fortifications were incomplete or poorly maintained. The doctrine emphasized holding ground rather than elastic defense. There were no strategic reserves, no mobile units capable of counterattacking Soviet breakthroughs. The army was trapped by its own limitations. Senior Kwantung officers knew they faced a superior enemy. They had seen what happened at Khalkhin Gol when General Zhukov's forces encircled and destroyed Japanese units using combined arms and deep penetration tactics. But knowing and adapting were different things. The Kwantung Army lacked the tanks, trucks, fuel, and training to implement mobile defense. They were forced to prepare for a war they knew they could not win, using tactics they knew were obsolete. Morale was fragile. Soldiers knew Japan was losing the war. Cities were burning under American bombs. The Navy was destroyed. Defeat was visible on the horizon, yet they were expected to defend an endless frontier against an enemy whose strength they could only guess at. Training was inadequate. Many conscripts had only weeks of preparation before being sent to remote border posts. Officers who had survived China or the Pacific were rare. Most leaders were garrison troops who had never experienced modern combat. Against this phantom army, the Soviets were about to unleash a form of warfare the Japanese had never experienced and could never have prepared for. The Germans had taught the Soviets how to fight modern war through 4 years of blood. Now the Japanese would face the graduates. Operation August Storm was the culmination of Soviet operational art, refined in the crucible of the Eastern Front. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky commanded the overall operation, coordinating 3 massive fronts in a campaign designed to annihilate Japanese forces through simultaneous multi-axis attacks, deep penetration, and relentless tempo. The Soviet force was overwhelming. The Trans-Baikal Front under General Rodion Malinovsky deployed approximately 416,000 troops, 1,850 tanks and self-propelled guns, 5,250 artillery pieces and mortars, and 4,400 aircraft. The First Far Eastern Front under General Kirill Meretskov fielded about 586,000 troops, 1,550 tanks, 7,400 artillery pieces, and 1,360 aircraft. The Second Far Eastern Front under General Maxim Prakayev added another 337,000 troops, 600 tanks, 4,200 artillery pieces, and 1,100 aircraft. In total, the Soviets massed approximately 1.6 million troops, between 3,000 and 5,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, depending on classification, around 17,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and roughly 3,700 aircraft. The disparity was crushing. Soviet tank forces outnumbered Japanese armor by at least 4 to 1, and the quality gap was even larger. Soviet T-34-85 medium tanks, IS-2 heavy tanks, and Su-76 and ISU-152 self-propelled guns were combat-proven designs that had broken the Wehrmacht. Japanese Type 97 and Type 95 tanks were lightly armored death traps armed with guns that could barely scratch Soviet armor. In some sectors, Soviet artillery enjoyed a 4 to 1 advantage. Soviet air power was absolute. The roughly 3,700 modern Yak-9 fighters, La-5 and La-7 fighters, and Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft faced about 1,800 obsolete Japanese planes, most of which could not even fly due to fuel shortages. But numbers alone do not explain what happened. The Soviets had developed a doctrine called deep operations, or glubokaya operatsiya, that transformed numerical superiority into operational annihilation. The concept was simple, but devastatingly effective. Instead of attacking on a single axis and grinding through defenses layer by layer, Soviet forces would attack simultaneously across multiple axes, penetrating deep into enemy rear areas. Operational maneuver groups, fast-moving formations of tanks and mechanized infantry, would exploit breakthroughs and drive hundreds of kilometers beyond the front line. They would bypass strong points rather than reducing them, leaving isolated defenders to be mopped up by follow-on forces. The goal was not to push the enemy back, but to encircle and destroy entire formations, shattering command and control and preventing any organized response. The Trans-Baikal Front executed the deepest and most audacious thrust. Malinovsky's forces faced what the Japanese considered an impassable natural barrier, the Greater Khingan Mountain Range. The mountains were rugged, arid, and cut by few roads. Japanese planners assumed no modern mechanized force could cross them quickly. They were catastrophically wrong. Soviet engineers and tank crews had prepared meticulously. When the offensive began on August 9, 1945, Soviet tank columns plunged into the mountains and emerged on the other side with stunning speed. One tank crewman later recalled the surreal experience. "We drove for days without stopping, the desert heat shimmering on our armor, and the Japanese had not even mined the passes. In some sectors, Soviet units covered up to 150 kilometers in a single day. The advance through terrain the Japanese thought would take weeks happened in days. By the time Japanese commanders realized the Soviets were across the mountains, Soviet spearheads were already seizing key cities and rail junctions deep in Manchuria. The three-front coordination was unprecedented. All three fronts attacked on August 9th, creating impossible dilemmas for Japanese commanders. Defend everywhere and be strong nowhere. Concentrate forces against one thrust and be encircled by the others. Japanese defensive doctrine, built around static lines and frontal defense, simply had no answer to simultaneous penetration on multiple axes. Soviet tank commanders who had fought through Poland, Ukraine, and Germany reported with astonishment how easily Japanese positions collapsed. Major General Vasily Ryazanov of the 5th Guards Tank Army noted that the Japanese positions melted away before our tanks, unlike the dogged resistance of the Germans. Veterans described the campaign as a walk compared to the hell of Berlin and Stalingrad. The contrast was stark. German defenders had fought for every meter, counter-attacking with panzers and panzerfausts, turning cities into fortresses. Japanese defenders, lacking mobile reserves and modern anti-tank weapons, could only watch as Soviet armor bypassed their bunkers and drove into the rear. What happened when these two military philosophies collided was less a battle than a systematic disintegration. In modern war, armies do not just lose battles, they lose the ability to fight at all. At midnight on August 9, 1945, Soviet forces attacked simultaneously across three fronts. The Japanese had intelligence indicating a Soviet buildup, but they achieved no meaningful strategic or tactical surprise. Yet within hours, Japanese defenses were crumbling. The speed of collapse shocked even Soviet commanders. Japanese static defensive positions, designed to stop World War I-style frontal assaults, were simply bypassed. Soviet operational maneuver groups identified weak points, punched through, and raced into the rear. Japanese strongpoints found themselves isolated, surrounded, and irrelevant. Communications collapsed almost immediately. Japanese commanders lost contact with forward units and had no reserves to plug breaches. Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Hayashi of the Kwantung Army captured the chaos in his memoir. It was as if a thunderbolt had struck. We had no time to organize, no reserves to plug the breaches. Soviet tanks appeared everywhere, and our communications collapsed. The experience was disorienting and terrifying. Units that had been preparing for frontal defense suddenly found Soviet armor in their rear areas. Officers who tried to coordinate responses found their phone lines dead and their messengers missing. The fog of war became total. The Trans-Baikal fronts thrust through the Greater Khingan Mountains turned the entire Japanese defensive concept on its flank. Japanese planners had assumed the mountains would channel any Soviet attack into predictable corridors where defenses could be concentrated. Instead, Soviet forces crossed the mountains on multiple axes and emerged deep in the Japanese rear. By the time Japanese commanders understood what was happening, Soviet spearheads were already seizing Mukden, Changchun, and Harbin. Merezkov's First Far Eastern Front, with 586,000 troops, began the drive toward the coast and the ultimate symbolic objective, Port Arthur. The fortress that had symbolized Russian humiliation in 1905 was now within reach. Soviet forces advanced with ruthless efficiency, brushing aside scattered Japanese resistance. The Japanese had no doctrine for responding to deep penetration. Their plans assumed they would fight a defensive battle along prepared lines, falling back to secondary positions if pressed. But there was no falling back. Soviet forces were already behind them. Attempts to withdraw turned into routs. Units that tried to establish new defensive lines found Soviet tanks arriving before they could dig in. The tempo of operations was beyond anything Japanese officers had experienced. But the opening breakthrough was only the beginning. What followed was a pursuit unlike anything seen in the Pacific War. Some military campaigns are remembered for their brutality. This one is remembered for its asymmetry. From August 9 to August 20, 1945, the Soviet military machine achieved one of the most lopsided victories in modern warfare. The final casualty figures revealed the campaign's devastating nature. Soviet losses totaled approximately 12,031 killed, wounded, and missing, including only 2,630 killed. Japanese losses exceeded 80,000 killed, with estimates of around 15,000 wounded, and between 594,000 and 650,000 taken prisoner. The kill ratio approached 30-1. Soviet forces advanced faster than in any European operation. Territorial gains were measured not in kilometers, but in hundreds of kilometers. In some sectors, Soviet spearheads covered up to 800 kilometers over the 11-day campaign, averaging between 40 and 70 kilometers per day. This pace exceeded even the most successful Soviet operations against Germany. The speed of advance maintained operational coherence despite the distances. Soviet logistics, honed through years of continental warfare, kept fuel, ammunition, and supplies flowing to advancing spearheads. Tank columns that covered 150 kilometers in a day still had fuel and ammunition when they reached their objectives. The mechanization that had crushed the Wehrmacht now crushed the Kwantung Army with even greater ease. Soviet tank commanders noted the stark contrast with their European experience. One officer wrote, "The Japanese positions melted away before our tanks, unlike the dogged resistance of the Germans." Another described the campaign as a walk compared to the hell of Berlin and Stalingrad. The difference was not courage. Japanese soldiers fought when they could. But they lacked the weapons, doctrine, and support to mount effective resistance against deep battle tactics. The collapse prevented any organized Japanese withdrawal or establishment of secondary defensive lines. Units that tried to retreat found Soviet forces already blocking their path. Strong points that held out found themselves surrounded and isolated, bypassed by the main Soviet advance. Retreat turned into rout. Rout turned into mass surrender. Key milestones marked the campaign's progress. By August 11 to 14, Soviet spearheads had crossed the Greater Khingan Mountains and seized key rail junctions. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Organized Japanese resistance collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers who had been fighting hours before laid down their weapons. Officers committed suicide rather than face the dishonor of surrender. By August 18 to 20, Soviet forces had seized Mukden, Changchun, Harbin, and Port Arthur. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese militarism, ceased to exist as a fighting force. The human experience of the collapse was chaotic and brutal. Japanese soldiers described the terror of facing an enemy that appeared everywhere at once. Soviet armor would emerge from unexpected directions, guns blazing. Air attacks were constant. There was no safe rear area. Communications were dead. Officers had no information and no orders. Men surrendered in groups of hundreds, then thousands. Some units fought to the last man. Others melted away. Civilians caught in the path of the Soviet advance faced violence, looting, and reprisals. The collapse of military order meant the collapse of all order. As Japanese armies disintegrated across Manchuria, the campaign's impact was being felt in a place far more important than any battlefield: the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. History remembers August 1945 for 2 atomic bombs, but Japanese leaders were equally terrified of what was happening in Manchuria. On August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing tens of thousands instantly. On August 9th, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The same day, the Soviet Union launched Operation August Storm. For Japanese leadership, the combination created a crisis that shattered any remaining hope of avoiding unconditional surrender. Imperial Conference minutes from August 9th and 10 reveal the panic the Soviet invasion created among top officials. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Army Chief Yoshijiro Umezu cited the Soviet entry as shattering any hope for mediation or continued resistance. Japan's strategy for ending the war had relied on the Soviet Union. Despite being ideological enemies, Stalin had maintained a neutrality pact with Japan. Japanese diplomats had been pursuing Soviet mediation for a negotiated peace that would allow Japan to avoid unconditional surrender and preserve the imperial system. The Soviet invasion destroyed that strategy in a single night. There would be no mediation. There would be no negotiated peace. Japan now faced a two-front war it could not possibly win. American forces were preparing to invade the home islands from the south. Soviet forces were destroying Japanese armies in Manchuria and would soon threaten Korea and the home islands from the north. The strategic situation was hopeless. Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa and others argue the Soviet invasion was the decisive factor in forcing Japan's surrender. The atomic bombs were devastating, but Japan had already endured months of conventional firebombing that killed more people than the atomic bombs. Japanese cities were burning. The civilian population was starving, yet the military leadership had continued to resist, preparing for a final defense of the home islands that would cost millions of lives. The Soviet invasion changed the calculation. It exposed Japanese mainland armies to immediate and total destruction. The speed of the Soviet advance meant that every hour of delay resulted in tens of thousands more troops lost and hundreds of kilometers more territory seized. The pressure was unbearable. If Japan did not surrender immediately, there would be nothing left to surrender. The combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion within 48 hours created a dual crisis that overwhelmed Japanese decision-making capacity. The Supreme War Council, which had been deadlocked between those favoring surrender and those demanding a final battle, broke. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. He cited the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb, but also the changing military situation. The Soviet invasion was implicit in that statement. Yet for the Soviets, the campaign's strategic impact was secondary to its symbolic meaning, the final settling of accounts. Military victories fade from memory, but the reversal of national humiliation becomes legend. Soviet forces deliberately raised the red banner over Port Arthur Fortress on August 22, 1945. Marshal Vasilevsky ensured the symbolic location received priority attention despite its limited military value. The fortress, whose fall in 1905 had symbolized Russian humiliation, now witnessed Russian triumph. The moment was captured in photographs and newsreels. Soviet propaganda made it the emotional centerpiece of victory celebrations. Official Soviet communiques and propaganda explicitly referenced settling accounts for 1905 and avenging Tsushima. The revenge narrative was not subtext, it was the text. Soviet newspapers ran headlines celebrating the reversal of 1905. Radio broadcasts reminded listeners of Tsushima and Mukden. Military orders of the day invoked the memory of Russian sailors who had died 40 years earlier. The campaign was framed as the redemption of national honor. The recapture of Port Arthur was laden with symbolism. In 1905, Japanese forces had besieged the fortress for months, finally capturing it after brutal fighting. Russian defenders had fought with courage, but they were doomed by poor leadership and inadequate support. The fall of Port Arthur had been the beginning of the end for Russian hopes in the war. Now, in 1945, Soviet forces recaptured the fortress with ease. There was no siege. There was barely any fighting. Japanese defenders surrendered or fled. The contrast could not have been more complete. Soviet military leadership connected the 1945 victory directly to the redemption of Russian national honor. Vasilevsky and other commanders gave speeches referencing the humiliations of 1905 and the triumph of 1945. The message was clear: the Soviet Union had avenged the Tsarist defeat. The shame of Tsushima was erased. Russia was no longer the sick man of Asia, but a superpower. The campaign demonstrated Soviet military supremacy in Asia and established the USSR as a Pacific power. In 1905, Russia had been defeated by an Asian nation. In 1945, the Soviet Union annihilated that same nation's army in 11 days. The reversal was total. The kill ratio of 30-1, the speed of advance, the overwhelming technological and tactical superiority all served to erase the memory of 1905 from Russian consciousness. The symbolism extended beyond Port Arthur. Soviet forces recaptured every piece of territory lost in 1905. Southern Sakhalin, ceded to Japan in the Treaty of Portsmouth, was retaken. The Kuril Islands, promised to Stalin at Yalta, were occupied. Soviet influence in Manchuria, lost in 1905, was restored. The geopolitical order of Northeast Asia was rewritten in 11 days. Yet for hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, the campaign's end marked not liberation, but the beginning of a different nightmare. The 11-day war was over, but for hundreds of thousands, the suffering had just begun. Between 594,000 and 650,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were taken prisoner by Soviet forces during and after Operation August Storm. This mass captivity represented one of the largest forced labor operations in modern history. The prisoners were deported to labor camps across Siberia and the Soviet Far East, where they worked in mines, forests, and construction projects under brutal conditions. The experience of Japanese prisoners of war in Soviet camps became a traumatic chapter in Japanese collective memory. Tens of thousands died from disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and cold. Survival rates were estimated at 80 to 85%, meaning between 90,000 and 130,000 prisoners died in captivity. Those who survived endured years of hard labor in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Many prisoners were not repatriated until 1956, 11 years after the war's end. The delay was deliberate. Stalin used the prisoners as a labor resource and as a bargaining chip in post-war negotiations with Japan. Families in Japan had no information about whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Men who had expected to return home after Japan's surrender found themselves trapped in a frozen hell with no end in sight. The POW experience represented the complete reversal of 1905. In that earlier war, Russian prisoners had suffered in Japanese camps. Now Japanese soldiers endured the same fate in Soviet hands. The cycle of revenge was complete, but the human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. The mass captivity also served Soviet strategic goals. The labor extracted from Japanese prisoners contributed to Soviet reconstruction efforts after the devastation of World War II. Prisoners built infrastructure, mined coal and minerals, and logged timber in regions where Soviet citizens were scarce. The economic value of forced labor was substantial. For Japan, the POW issue poisoned relations with the Soviet Union for decades. The slow return of prisoners, the lack of information, and the deaths in captivity created lasting bitterness. Even today, the fate of Japanese prisoners in Siberia remains a sensitive topic in Japanese historical memory. Operation August Storm thus became a campaign of multiple meanings: military revolution, historical revenge, strategic earthquake, and human tragedy, all compressed into 11 days that changed the course of World War II and settled a 40-year-old debt. Operation August Storm answered the historical question definitively. It was simultaneously the Soviet Union's calculated revenge for 1905's humiliation, and a devastating demonstration that modern deep battle doctrine could annihilate an army still fighting the previous war. In 11 days, the Soviets achieved a kill ratio of 30-1. They advanced faster than any European campaign, covering up to 800 kilometers and averaging 40 to 70 kilometers per day. They deployed 1.6 million troops, 5,500 tanks, and 3,700 aircraft against a hollowed-out Japanese force that existed more on paper than in reality. The result was not a battle, but a systematic disintegration. The campaign may have been as decisive as the atomic weapons in forcing Japan's surrender. Japanese Imperial Conference minutes reveal that top leaders cited the Soviet invasion as shattering their last hope for mediated peace. The combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion within 48 hours created a crisis that broke the deadlock in Tokyo and forced Emperor Hirohito to announce surrender on August 15th. The revenge narrative was explicit and deliberate. Soviet commanders and propaganda invoked settling accounts for 1905. The red banner raised over Port Arthur Fortress symbolized the reversal of Tsushima. Every piece of territory lost in 1905 was recaptured. The geopolitical humiliation was erased through overwhelming military superiority. But the campaign also proved a broader point about modern warfare. The gap between doctrines matters more than the gap between courage. Japanese soldiers fought when they could, but they were trapped in World War I defensive concepts, facing an enemy that had mastered World War II operational art. Static defenses were bypassed. Linear thinking was shattered by simultaneous multi-axis attacks. Courage could not overcome obsolete equipment, inadequate training, and a doctrine designed for a war that no longer existed. The Soviet deep battle tactics employed in Manchuria represented the culmination of 4 years of brutal learning on the Eastern Front. Operational maneuver groups penetrated hundreds of kilometers, bypassing strong points and encircling entire formations. The tempo of operations prevented any organized response. The coordination of 3 fronts attacking simultaneously created impossible dilemmas for Japanese commanders. The result was a form of warfare that rendered traditional defensive concepts obsolete. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. The mass captivity of up to 650,000 Japanese prisoners and their deportation to Siberian labor camps created a humanitarian disaster that lasted for over a decade. Tens of thousands died in captivity. Those who survived carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. The POW experience became a bitter coda to the military catastrophe. The legacy of Operation August Storm is complex. It demonstrated Soviet military prowess and established the USSR as a Pacific superpower. It may have been decisive in ending World War II. It settled a 40-year-old debt of national humiliation. But it also revealed the brutal logic of modern warfare, where technological and doctrinal superiority can turn battles into massacres, and where the human cost of victory and defeat extends far beyond the battlefield. The red banner over Port Arthur in 1945 did not just mark a military victory. It erased Tsushima from Russian memory and announced the arrival of a new superpower in Asia, born from the ashes of 1905's defeat. The Kwantung Army, once the terror of Asia, was erased in 11 days, and the world learned that some historical debts are paid not in diplomacy, but in the complete destruction of armies. If you enjoyed this story, Hit subscribe for more WWW2 historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.